We've got Robert Kitson of The Guardian on the line to get the view from England about just how prepared Eddie Jones' squad is for the start of the Six Nations. Rob, good morning to you. I guess that is my first question. What's the general sense of preparedness at the moment when it comes to the available players, the style of play and where England are with regards to what you can expect from them in the Six Nations?
Well, good morning. It depends if you take the view that you rely on Europe for your form guide or you rely on certain other measures. If you're relying on Europe, clearly it wouldn't be all that optimistic, would it, given only Saracens have made the last 8. But if you talk to Eddie Jones, he makes a clear distinction. He always has done between what happens at club level and what happens at international level. And on that front, England actually they've got one or two bumps and bruises, but they haven't got as bad an injury situation as they have had in the last, certainly compared with last year. And so from that point of view, I know there's a doubt about Owen Farrell. We're still not quite sure how his thumb is for that opening match. But give or take that, they've got Vunipola back, both of them. They've got Maro Itoje back, who makes a big difference. I think cautiously more optimistic than they maybe were last year.
The hangover from the Lions seemed to affect England very significantly last year. Itoje's form, he just looked like a player who was very tired. He didn't have that dynamism that we would have expected from him, that game-breaking ability, just the ability to take over a game that we've seen him do. Is he back to something like that rampaging best?
Well, I think so. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Lions tour didn't seem to affect all the Irish boys particularly, did it? But it did affect a lot of the English guys, and you got to be careful you disappear down the that argument of how you prepare your players best. But yeah, I think absolutely. I think a number of England's top players are looking a little bit sharper at the moment than they were last year, certainly.
In terms of the style of play, do we know exactly what Eddie Jones' England looks like, what their identity is? Because it seems as if every time a certain style of play emerges, the players that it's built around go down with injury. I'm thinking about number 8 and I'm thinking about the centres and I'm just thinking about what he wants his ball carriers to do in particular. It seems that maybe finally he's going to have his first choice pack and his first choice centre pairing to be able to dominate and carry that ball and be that kind of old school side. Is that being unfair, or is that actually the kind of what he's trying to turn this team into?
No, I think that's not unfair at all. I think two of the words you used there were ball carrier and dominate, and I think those feature very highly in Eddie's lexicon. I think he's had a look at what he's got. He's decided that he's not going to rival the All Blacks. England aren't going to rival the All Blacks or anybody else when it comes to spreading it wide and just completely having an all-court game maybe. So he wants to break the gain line, preferably as quickly as possible, preferably with a big bloke with the ball in his hands. And yeah, it is tricky because you can't pack your side with 15 giants clearly, and at the exclusion of all the other more subtle skills. That said, if you've got Tio, maybe Tuolangi, maybe both of them in your centres, if you've got a back row with at least one Vunipola at number 8 and a couple of other pretty big beasts roaming around, I think it makes England more difficult to play against. I think that's what Eddie really wants. He wants them to be a real tough nut to crack, and I think if you've got that, then yeah, you've got a chance in any game, haven't you?
Rob, good morning. It's Alan Quinlan here. I was just wondering, is Eddie under pressure given the results last year, or did he get a little bit of a pass with some of the injuries like the Vunipolos and having maybe Tuolangi back in the mix? And what's the expectations for this Six Nations? If he loses the first game, or if he doesn't do well in the Six Nations, or is the bigger picture just the World Cup for England?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He was definitely under pressure at the start of the autumn. There was a lot of, off the back of that losing tour in South Africa. I think in the autumn they played well for a good spell against New Zealand. They had a very good 20 minutes against Australia. And I think that's reassured certainly him and maybe a few other people that there is some scope there. Having said that, I think if you asked him, he'd say, listen, all I'm concentrating on is the World Cup. Yes, obviously the next match, all those sorts of cliches, but the World Cup is what he was appointed to do well in, and he's hanging his hat very much on that. If you're saying, are they on track for the World Cup, I would say they're 6 months behind where they would ideally like to be for various reasons. Injuries fairly high amongst that.
I know you said at the start, if you're going on European form, that it's not looking so optimistic, but I tell you, given the names that you rattled off and the squad they will have for Saturday week, we certainly won't underestimate him. And I think I'm not being just giving you compliments here, but I think that English side, if he gets everyone fit and well, they're well capable of not just winning the Six Nations, but competing at the World Cup again, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and I think you're right, potentially, but that's always that word potentially, isn't it? They've got to show it in these big games, and I think the two big games for them in the Six Nations, without question, are obviously the one in Dublin and the one in Cardiff. You know, away from Twickenham, away from those home comforts, and if they win, I'd have thought you'd have to win one of those to be taken seriously to win a World Cup, wouldn't you? I think it's certainly where I'm sitting.
But I think if they get Dublin's tricky for both sides, for Ireland and England. You know, you think it's the big two at the moment up first, and it's a tough start. You'd certainly like the kind of easier way, a small bit, even though it's difficult in the Six Nations. But I think if he gets a result or a really good performance in Dublin, and then gets that result away, I think that could kickstart a bit of a resurgence in this team, because genuinely there's some outstanding players in that English squad, and if they gel together, I think they could seriously get back on track.
Yeah, it's interesting. And if you look, we all say it's so easy to generalise about Europe, isn't it? But actually, you look at who's top seeds in Europe. You know, Saracens, who providing a big chunk of the England team, Saracens. So it doesn't necessarily apply that England are completely hopeless.
No, but there is, I'm sure, concerns from an English club point of view, and I know you've already pointed out the disconnect to a certain extent between the RFU and the Premiership clubs, certainly more disconnected than the RFU will be with the Irish provinces. So even allowing for that, there must be a little bit of concern from Eddie Jones's point of view that the Premiership teams haven't performed as well as they did in Europe. Or is he buying into the narrative that, say, the Premiership clubs just care about the Gallagher Premiership and really the European Cup is actually second fiddle?
Well, I think from his perspective, he's always drawn a slight distinction. Of course, he would like to see lots of English clubs doing well, but in many ways, it's a problem that's been around long before him. You know, I was just looking at the stats. You know, it's in the last 10 years, 7 of those 10 years, English clubs haven't been able to get more than 2 sides through to the quarterfinals of Europe, of the Champions Cup. So that's not a blip or a sort of cycle, really. That's a bit of a trend. You know, I think it boils down. It does boil down without question. It's not about money, particularly because Edinburgh, are right up there, aren't they? So I think it's more to how much you can prioritise the competition, just in your own head, even if it's not about resting players or what have you. It's giving it a real good run, and I think some of those English sides. I think, funnily enough, it'll be better next year. I think Leicester will be better. I think Sale will be better. For example, Northampton coming up, Saracens, Exeter. So I think watch his space a little bit, because I think it might be, you never know, the wheel can turn. But a little bit, I think English rugby, as Alan's saying, I think they've got the players. It's just a case of getting all your ducks in a row and making sure that they're really firing to their maximum potential.
Rob, it's Alan again. Do you envisage change in the structure of the Gallagher Premiership? And I did read your piece a couple of weeks ago after Munster beat Gloucester, and I know you were getting a bit of banter from people online, and I agreed with what you said, and we don't disagree that the player welfare system here is really good. And I've spoken about it. I played in it. I was one of those players who got managed in that system before. But do you think it's time for a little bit of change in the clubs? And I do understand also that the Gallagher Premiership is the bread and butter, is the financial kind of driver for the English clubs. But genuinely, we as the Irish provinces, who, our model is good and we're happy with it, we'd love to see, the English teams kind of, particularly some of, Wasps and Bath were poor this year, Leicester were really poor. It makes for a better competition. Yeah,
I mean, well, you'll be glad to hear that I read the very good piece that you wrote the other day as well.
And it wasn't insulting, I hope, to it was just laying down a couple of pointers that I genuinely believe they have to do something now and listen to the players, and it will benefit the game in general, I think, myself. But
yeah, no, I think there's, without question, there's a lot of improvement to be made in England and what happens between players 17, 18 up to 21. I think there's big issues there, to be honest, because either these guys aren't playing or they're...
They don't seem to be coming through, the young players, and I'm surprised because, their under-20s dominated at World Cup level. The Six Nations, they dominate. And there's just not a huge number of them kind of jumping through. I know Singleton and Thorley now are in the Eddie Jones' squad. And maybe it's a bit of luck. We've produced Larmer and Levy and Ryan and these guys in the last kind of 2 seasons. Maybe it's just a bit of luck on our side. But I'm just sometimes surprised that you don't see a kind of raft of 4 or 5, 19, 20, 21-year-olds grabbing attention at international level and kind of making that step up really quickly. And Dai Young has been quite outspoken as well. Where's all his academy players? Where's his depth?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm with you, and I'm not sure that's a problem that goes away overnight. I think often those younger English players physically they'll dominate maybe at under 20 level. They're pretty good at producing big blokes. But just that step up, when they've got to really thrive and that next level and the skills that you need don't tend to be there, or are there in very few cases. And you're right. I mean, they haven't really produced your Fords and your Farrells, that golden sort of the Itojis, the sort of golden generation Slades, if you like. Who did so well in those years. I'm not so sure. They a decent year side this year, I think, England under 20, but it's a long way to the top from there, as I say.
They have produced them, but I would expect a raft of more guys. But anyway, look, thanks for that.
I did want to ask you about who you think is going to be the starting halfback partnership. You kind of forget that there's been this attempt to get the 2 10s playing 10 and 12 at various stages over the last 18 months or so. Is it time for Eddie Jones to decide one of his out-halves is better than the other, and that Eoin Farrell, assuming he's fit, will start at 10 now and all the way through to the World Cup?
Well, it's not quite that simple, to be honest. Farrell's got this thumb problem, so if he doesn't start, then Ford has to start probably. Farrell's obviously his captain. I think where Farrell wants to play, he wants to play at 10. So does George Ford. But for the good of the side, they still haven't really nailed down the inside centre position. So there's a few things going around. I think in a perfect world, he'd have Farrell and two big centres, with maybe George Ford coming on when the game breaks up a little bit later on. Farrell moving out to 12. I think that's probably what he's looking at, but that might be slightly different for this start of this Six Nations.
And who do you think is going to be the starting scrum half?
So scrum half, well, that's another good question. It should be Ben Youngs in the sense that he's the man in possession. I'd keep an eye on this Dan Robson. He's uncapped, but he should have played at least a couple of years ago. I think he's a good player. But again, it's a step up. I think Eddie should have blooded him a little bit earlier, had the opportunity to, didn't take it. So a little bit open. It wouldn't entirely surprise me if he went for Robson. But I think that'll be decided in training in Portugal next week.
Final one from me anyway, Rob. Do you think that Eddie Jones is correct in the fact that he says that Johnny Sexton has the bat phone and he's got this phone that only he's allowed to pick up to the referees?
Well, I think we all know that Eddie likes to stir the pot occasionally. Johnny, as you know, a big admirer of Johnny Sexton. I think he's a top player, and I think he's entitled to talk to referees, particularly when he's captain, of Leinster. So, I think it's just one of those little pebbles in the pond.
I'm a Munster man anyway, Rob, and I agree with Eddie. I'm joking. He does. He's some of his comments are funny and humorous. I actually 2 years ago I was like, I hate Eddie Jones now because he brought Sexton's parents into it, but. In the last 2 years, I've just become to enjoy the little bit of banter and the stuff he throws out there. It's all mind games, and it'll have no effect the next week. It should be a cracker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rob, good stuff. Thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.